Good evening and welcome to the World in Around 80 Days. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host and a veteran game master with more than 50 years behind the shield, and I'm here to help you make your game the most excellent it can be. This is another episode of World Building, and so we're going to jump right into it in a moment. But first, I want to remind you that if you haven't yet, hit all the buttons down below, like, subscribe, follow. It all helps the channel. And in particular, when you get a chance, go to the YouTube channel at NycosRPG and check out all the playlists. There's some great videos put together. I have over 700 videos, including some really antiques when I used to do live streaming for small groups, and also some really cool informational videos. And this series, as a matter of fact, The World in Around 80 Days, can be found there as well. Alrighty, so today we are talking about one of the framework modules. As I spoke about in an earlier video, there is a framework process. The World in Around 80 Days is intentionally built to create the concept of building out your adventure, your world, in the quickest way possible, meaning that theoretically in around 80 days you can have everything you need to have a complete fantasy genre setting. And so today's framework module in particular is talking about, but didn't hit, wandering monsters. Now you might think that, well, Jonathan, why wouldn't wandering monsters be something you would add really late in the process, because you'd have to have all of the monsters created for the world in order to know what wanders in an area. But the framework modules are actually set up so that while you are building the macro scale and the micro scale in their nesting doll format, which we've done a video on, that's going to be located here. Put the little arrow pointer thing. I think it actually pops up over there. But the idea is that it will put that mark on the screen and let you know that's where you can find out about the nesting doll strategy that is essential to the World in Around 80 Days method. But the wandering monsters are actually part of the frameworks, and the frameworks process is that you want to be able to play your game as quickly as possible. You want to be able to engage your players as quickly as possible. So you create the wandering monsters list as a portion of the frame that helps you build out and fill in all the spaces in your game world as you go along, so you're not having to sit and do drudgery work in between to understand how things work. But to do this, we really have to have an understanding of what a wandering monsters list is. In the earlier versions of role-play games like Dungeons and Dragons, they would give you a categorical list based on the climate you're in, the elevation you're at, the type of biome you're in, and even in ultimate cases, there were random monster tables for every level of an adventure underground or every area of a investigation or search kind of a campaign. And there was even those that were colloquially identifiable, so you could do a travelogue adventure and plug in the appropriate type of creature that might be found in that region. And all pardon me. And each of those methods are perfectly acceptable for the process of getting your world built, but some of them make more sense or less sense. So today we're going to be talking about what your monsters need to require to be qualified to be on your wandering monsters list. And this is more, if you will, the meta play portion of for a game master than it is for the actual engagement of play. We'll do other videos about that and how to run them in our other segments, such as the Game Master's Toolbox, where I'll provide you resources, or Game Master's Soapbox, where I'll just give you my 2 cents as a designer. But today we're going to be looking at these in terms of what a given monster would need to have to be understandable in your wandering monsters list for a given location. So first thing we're going to talk about is, does it make sense? Is the creature that you're wanting to bring into the session as a random effect actually makes sense to be there? A great example of this I can remember happened several years ago when I was playing at another person's table. So this had to be better than 10 years ago. At any rate, when this game master introduced us to a being, according to him, by a random rolling of a dice, we ran into a creature that was fundamentally an animated, chaotic, and berserk Jack in the Box. It literally moved the way the Jack in the Box did, for example, on the Island of Misfit Toys in the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer claymation holiday program. And it literally, the head would leap out and grab something and drag the box to it, and then it would stand back up, and then it would jump again. The idea of it was kind of clever, but it made no sense. We were not in a weird land of misfit toys or anything strange like that. He just had this idea for a creature, and he wanted to include it in his game for that week, and so he put it into his random monster tables. Now, early Dungeons and Dragons, this would have been acceptable. In the early days, you literally would randomize the interior of your dungeon in many ways so that you could actually play as well as game master, because it was difficult to get enough players together, especially when the game was brand new. But it didn't, in a world building sense, if the creature doesn't make any sense, then it really is irrelevant to put it in the scene. So knowing whether or not the monster makes sense is rather critical to that process. Next, we have to consider, is this creature in particular indigenous to this area? A wandering monster might in truth be moving from one locale to another, such as it might be a dinosaur or a reptilian creature or maybe even an avian creature that has a migration pattern. And so maybe its movement is part of that. So if we understand that that being or that creature is indigenous to this area, these would be the creatures, for example, that would be more common on your random tables. So therefore, an indigenous being really does make sense. Now, whether this creature is something that you interact with verbally, whether you actually can have a conversation with it, or if it is something that you are prone to fight because it's a predator and angry, that's not yet qualified here. This is just saying, is it indigenous? Is it localized to this area? Can it be found? And if it is, then it's more likely to be possibly added to a random monster generation table. Now, when I say wandering, this term does really literally only mean that it's being added to the random tables for being available. And generally, creatures that are put on a wandering monsters table are not story monsters. They're not part of the plot of the story or whatever, although they could be. And we'll get into that perhaps a little bit later under one of the other headings. But the idea here is that if it's something that lives in the area, that makes it much more likely and therefore is able to be easier to find, more common to find in a given area. Next is it reasonable? And by that, I'm not referring to whether or not it can talk. I'm speaking in this case of whether or not it's a reasonable assumption that the creature could be found in that area. For example, if there is a creature who lives, has a diurnal cycle generally found in the daytime, but prefers ultra warm climates, why would it be reasonable for it to be in say a temperate or even an Arctic zone? This reasonability will affect its rarity. If it's a common creature, then it should also be reasonable that it might be found there. But if it is something that is off the wall or unique or something of your own devising that doesn't fit the rest of the world as you've described it, it's not really reasonable. And therefore, the purpose and the method by which it got to be there will change its commonality. It simply won't be as common a discovery. It'll be something that just mayhap exist. Anyway, Now that we've done that, now we're going to be talking about our next header. We talked about it being reasonable, and therefore the reasonability factor will determine how common or rare it is. If it is unreasonable for it to be in a zone, even if it's indigenous, it might not be likely that it travels. So, for example, if it is a form of plant life and therefore is stuck to a specific location, the odds of finding it in a wandering capacity is not really reasonable unless you do more to pursue that, as you'll see here in a minute. This leads, of course, to the question, why is this being wandering? Why is it not in its locale? If it is a creature or a being that is specifically attuned to a climate and to a certain lifestyle and a certain, say, feeding pattern, why is it included in this table? If it's something that it's reasonable for it to move around, it's local, it's indigenous, and all of that, then sure, but why is it wandering? Perhaps it was driven from its home. Perhaps it's a hunting being. Maybe it's, a creature that roams naturally. If so, that makes perfect sense. But asking yourself why it's roaming or why it's wandering makes the rarity, again, a creature that's indigenous, reasonable, and wandering, because it is a nomadic being, then that makes perfect sense for it to be a commonly found one. Gotta move my buttons here. Next. Okay, so let's assume that it is a roaming beastie. Where's it from? Does it have a home? If it's a common creature in the local area that lives there, perhaps there's not any reason for it to not be there, and therefore its commonality would be extremely high. But if it's, say, from a mountainous region, and you are currently playing in the hills or even the lowlands, where'd it come from? Why is it here? And if you have an understanding of that, perhaps you can allow your players to, for example, if they are trappers, maybe they want to find where there are more of them like this, and therefore being able to track back where it came from. This allows the players to use their skills that they might have about hunting, trapping, animal lore, and the like, and therefore they can align what they are doing with the scene more readily if they understand where the being is from, or at least can find out, discover what that is. On the other hand, perhaps they are beings that don't normally travel, and they're not normally from this area. How did they get to be here? A creature that might be here but is not normally reasonable to be here might have a pretty high rarity, but if you make it so that it has a reason or a place to be from, then all of a sudden you can increase its commonality on your table. And remember, when you're working on the Wandering Monsters list, we'll do in a later episode exactly how you would create your commonality bracket, because that itself is kind of a mystery. But the idea here is that we're only dealing with what creatures can be put on your Wandering Monsters list. And realize that the reason why all of these things, and we're only halfway through the list or so, we got a few more, but the reason why the Wandering Monster list is a part of the framework is that, let's say you've built the where's it from, but you've also built with your nesting dolls mentality a larger place where it could be from, then it makes it easier for you to explain to your players how it came to be where it is, or how they might be able to pursue that creature back to its source if it gets away from them. Next one, and this is really important when you talk about a wandering creature, is it violating any laws being where it is? That is to say, wandering monsters, by definition, can include sentient beings. It's not necessarily only a list of wandering. Other people use the term random encounters for wandering monsters. I'm using the older term because I'm kind of keen to my ancient roots as a dungeon master. The idea of a roaming encounter could be individuals. And if these individuals are not breaking any laws, then the concept of the players entering a conflict with them automatically begs the question of what the reasoning for that would be. Are the players the ones, therefore, that would be violating laws by assaulting or engaging with these people as enemies? Or is it just simply a situation where the encounter might be one where there is a conversation or a discussion? If, on the other hand, the creature is not supposed to be there, it's not reasonable for it to be there, you've made it a wandering being for a reason, perhaps it's migratory or it's on a pilgrimage. When you take all those things, when you take these items and kind of mush them together, you get an idea of how they would fit in that rarity. If it's a being that is currently violating a law, perhaps it's doing so by even being there. It might be a foreigner from a foreign land with whom the locals have a war. These are all things that will expand your thought process as you're building the world, if you remember to look at that as you're building your random encounters. Now realize this means that you might be running an adventure in a space you haven't mapped out yet, and yet by having these questions at mind when you put the creatures onto your roaming encounters list, your wandering monsters list, you'll then be able to start to build a larger worldview beyond the framework of the space that you're playing in, if that helps make sense. Next will be you need to provide this being with a purpose. If this being has sentience, is violating a law, you have to explain why it's breaking the law, what it is that it's doing, why it is in that space. I need to hop over for a second. Give me a moment. We'll be clipping this out as well. Hey, Gene, this is Jonathan. Just want to make sure you know you're here, but I'm actually keeping myself muted so I can get through the details of my episode. Are you currently watching on Twitch, or are you just waiting in the room to talk? Okay, so I just want to make sure. Also, just so you know, for your own benefit, if you are listening to it and also to Discord, you'll get echoes. And the easiest way to do that is to just shut off the microphone on Twitch and only hear my voice over Discord, or conversely, cut off Discord's deafen Discord and only listen to the video. So it's your choice. Okay, I will come back and talk to you when I'm finished. All right? Alrighty, so I'm back. So we are now talking about how to provide or what you need to do in terms of a random encounter. You need to provide it with a purpose. The individual is on your list of random encounters, so it must be here for a purpose. If it's not violating laws and it's unreasonable for it to be here, it's not indigenous, then how did it get to be here, and why is it here? What is it on its way to someplace? Is it here specifically to hunt the players? There are possibilities of putting things like bounty hunters and local story encounters, so NEPs that are either window dressing, or perhaps more likely they would be either recurring NEPs or story NEPs that you could plug into it. So realize that the random encounter may not really be specifically random. If you are wanting or hoping that they will run into this person, my recommendation would be to pull them from the roaming list and make them just a straight encounter. But you could leave it to a random thing, especially if you are buying time or you're trying to delay the players reaching of their specific goal for the day or whatever. And the final point that I want to bring up in this is you want to give this a story. Whatever your random encounter is, whether it be pure roll of the dice, I'm bored this afternoon and I just want to have some kind of an encounter, great. That's one reason to give it a story. Find a reason for that being, that value to be on your random encounters list, so when the players do engage with it, you have a story to tell them. Because it's one thing to say, well, roll the dice and we're going to see what your random encounter is, but that's not nearly as useful as asking them to roll the dice, looking at your chart and saying, as you happen along your pathway, ... and giving them the narrative of why that encounter is occurring. Each one of these steps, if you noticed, from the beginning to the end of this short list of things that you want to consider for your wandering monster, again referring to the legacy versions of Dungeons and Dragons that didn't actually acknowledge the difference between sentience and wild things. If you can, as you're plugging them in to create your wandering or random encounters listing, have this discussion, have these thought processes in your mind, then that random encounters list becomes sort of for you as the game master, becomes a choose your own adventure methodology that allows the players more agency in which of these they want to pursue. If they run into a random encounter and you don't have a story behind it, they'll kill the monster and then beg you for more. Okay, what's next? And that is arguably good for a system where you're plotting just to give them experience points at a metered rate. That's one way to do it. But if you want to keep your players coming back, engage them more clearly, and give them more alternatives, use something like this. For example, let's say you've got a list and you want to have 5 or 6 fairly common types of encounters. Well, you want those to be indigenous, common creatures that have a purpose for wandering, that are from the local area, that are, not necessarily breaking any laws, and don't necessarily have to have the idea of a sentient purpose for being there. But you can still give them the story of, well, as you may know, you are in the northern steppes region of Shuntroa, and there are a vast number of wandering beings in this area, both carnivores and omnivores and herbivores. And as you've happened across this, you have found a small herd of what you have learned to call nerfs. And they don't seem to have any guidance, but you do hear a small child calling to you. Well, of course, if you don't know what a nerf is or whatever, then you get to go through the fuller explanation of that. If they know anything about nerfs, then they would understand perhaps what the crying of a child might represent. And if not, they're going to have a fun adventure trying to figure out what the crying child has to do with this seemingly random herd of herbivores. So the point is that you can make every encounter meaningful, useful, and feed into the concept of the breadth and width of your world far easier than if you just simply, rack up the direct encounters that they must have. This variability also lends itself to their seeing that the world is more expansive and there are far more things between heaven and earth, Horatio, that, as the saying goes, than are dreamt of yet in your imaginations. And now with Nykos's mechanism of the framework modules, you can start to build out this framework and create a deeper world in a faster way. I hope this has really helped, and I hope to see you again in our next episode. We are staying here on Twitch. I'm going to be stopping the presentation, so to speak, only in saying thank you for watching. We will see you next time on NycosRPG, The World in Around 80 Days.